A deep dive into the Martha Moxley murder, the unbelievable twists and turns over 50 years in the murder in Greenwich on Halloween Eve, known as Mischief Night, in the exclusive Bellhaven Enclave in Greenwich. A whodunit that never ends, featuring speaking out for the first time ever, Michael Skakel, who was convicted 25 years after the murder, only to have his conviction vacated on appeal after serving 11 years in prison. All of this on this edition of Jim Campbell Radio. Andrew Goldman, renowned interviewer, veteran magazine journalist, editor, creator, writer, host of the NBC hit series Dead Certain, the Martha Moxley Murder. The 12-episode series re-examines the infamous 1975 killing of the 15-year-old Martha Moxley in Greenwich, Connecticut, again featuring never before heard audio from Greenwich police interrogations right after the murder. Andrew Goldman, the host of the Originals podcast. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal Magazine, LA Magazine, Town and Country, the New York Times Magazine, and New York Magazine. Welcome, Andrew. An honor to have you.
My pleasure to be here. It's great to be with you.
It's interesting because we have kind of a mirror relationship deal. I have come to know Tommy Skakel pretty well, and I know the Moxleys well, and you've obviously come to know Michael well. Interesting, Tommy came out of an interview I did with Bobby Kennedy that he reached out to me and said, good interview. And then we ended up becoming friends. He's always kind of said that if he speaks, he'll talk to me. I have not pressed him on that up to this point. As I've told him, it's going to be his decision, not mine. And I got to tell you, this was an outstanding piece of work. Psychologically, it took me a while to want to listen because obviously I found you were the ghostwriter of Framed, Bobby Kennedy's book, which I'm not a huge fan of. And I found that saying, well, how's he going to be able to be neutral? He's not going to be objective. Can I listen to this? And I listened to it. I'm wrong. You did a tremendous job. How did you separate the work you did for RFK's book? Were you a fact checker on that? Do you have an NDA or anything? How did you stay objective in your own project?
I had an NDA with my conversations specifically with Bobby, so you didn't hear Bobby's voice from any of my conversations with Bobby, and you didn't hear audio from my interviews that I did for the book. Bobby came to me with an idea in 2015 that he wanted to do a book about his brother Michael not being guilty, and that was the first hurdle for me because I had followed the media and I had I didn't follow it quite as closely as I did OJ, but I followed it closely enough so that I thought that if they were going to try Michael Skakel in 2002 for a 1975 murder, they must have had some good stuff. They must have had a fairly good case. And if you read the media and if you watched court TV and you listened to the Nancy Graces of the world, I think that I was under the impression that Michael was likely guilty, and so I had a moment where I thought to myself, geez, look, magazine journalism, even in 2015, it's not what it is in 2024, but it was still tough. So I was at a moment of liberty, as they say. I had some time, and it was a really interesting case, but I struggled because I didn't want to do what I think generations of journalists have done before, which is to whitewash kind of bad deeds from, Kennedy's and Kennedy relatives, going back to JFK, and of course, Chappaquiddick, William Kennedy Smith. I feel like there was, the so-called Kennedy machine working hard to help a number of Kennedys escape justice. And I felt, as had been played in the media, that Michael Skakel was yet another one of these people who tried, ultimately failed to escape justice using the great Kennedy machine. That was how it was played in the media. I read, before I got involved in the case, I read Len Levitt's book. Len Levitt obviously kind of owned the case for a long period of time, writing for Newsday. I read Mark Furman's book, which, for the first time, I think publicly cast Michael as the likely suspect over his brother Tommy, who'd been the longtime suspect. I read Greentown, which was the book by Tim Dumas. I read everything, and I read the clips, and I said, geez, am I really, really going to get involved in this case? Because I think conviction, especially Len Levitt's book, was fairly convincing. about Michael's guilt. And I said, do I really want to do this? And I don't know if you've experienced this before, Jim, but my curiosity, I think, trumped my my I don't know if you want to call it conscience, but I talked to my wife about it, and I talked to my psychologist about it, and they said, why don't you behave as though you're a defense attorney, and why don't you sort of assemble the best case that suggests that maybe look at it, look at the case, and at that point I went deeply into the case, and when I met Michael for the first time, as I say in the podcast, and I shook his hand, I was convinced that I was shaking the hand of the man who had held the club that had beat Martha Moxley to death. And it was a really disturbing experience. But then I went to Rockville Superior Court, and this was after Michael's habeas petition was granted, and all of the papers from the golf club was the evidence was there. Thousands of pages of police reports were there, and evidence from all of his appeals. And I started going through it, and I spent weeks and weeks on it, and I just kept flipping and waiting for the point where I was going to see the evidence that Michael did it. And I never found it. And to this day, I haven't found it. And as I told Stephen Skakel and I told Michael Skakel, I'm going to spend a lot more time than I spent on Bobby's book looking at this case. And if I ever find some evidence that suggests to me that Michael is the guy, I'm going to report it. There's no way. And I think Stephen Skakel, who's Michael's younger brother, who in a lot of ways has been the manager of the case and Michael's protector, and Michael's, he provides Michael advice, and Stephen's the one who goes to all the meetings to find new lawyers. This is not something that I think Michael would thrive at. Stephen's very, very organized, and he has a long record in the nonprofit world. And Stephen said, have at it. Look as much as you can. And I wouldn't blame you if you found something, but Stephen was so convinced of Michael's innocence that he really opened up not only archives that he had, but private correspondence that included correspondence from the family lawyer, Tom Sheridan. And so I got to see everything, and I got to see the perspective of the father, Rush Skakel, who Mark Furman believed was quarterbacking a conspiracy to keep Michael from justice. And I didn't see the narrative.
Yeah, that's not correct.
Yeah, well, that was not correct. But nothing, but very, very little of what was reported was correct. And, I think if you listen to my 12-part podcast, and it's funny, I go on social media, and there are people who are still citing Furman's book, who are still citing Dominic Dunn's reporting on it as a defense for the initial conviction of Michael. And I just feel like I took 12 hours, and I don't know, Jim, how you felt after those 12 hours, but I don't know that you could emerge from that and still have any kind of confidence that Michael was the guy.
I'll tell you where I come out of it is kind of where I've been all along. First off, all these other killers and stuff, the caveman, the tutor, we can talk about them. I view that as Bobby Kennedy's version of the 2020 Trump election, where you just keep going to conspiracy theories, even though the truth is sitting right there. And the truth to me, and it will go on, is it's either Tommy or Michael, and there's nobody else. And it's a rage killing, which would lean towards one of the others. But we'll go into the details of that. And that's what I think is impressive about yours, is you obviously want to solve this. You want to be the hero at the end, and you admit, I can't do it. I can't tell you whether Michael's totally innocent or totally guilty. And you called it just like it really is. There is reasonable doubt. And that's all there's ever going to be, I think. In fact, is dead certain meant to be a parody of reasonable doubt because there is no dead certainty?
Dead Certain was something that we came up with because NBC didn't like my original title, which was Dead to Rights, which was sort of ironic, which I felt like, the idea of dead to rights, and half the people I was shocked that it's funny dealing with young people. They didn't know what the expression dead to rights meant, but I thought there was a certain irony in the idea that they thought that they had this guy dead to rights, like they had the case down. But there's also a double entendre, which I think Michael was denied a lot of his rights. So Dead Certain was sort of a second choice. I don't think it's bad.
It's interesting. It's interesting the whole thing, and you do I think end up with a very honest um, final assessment. In the remaining minute of this segment, how'd you get Michael to talk, and how did you get access to all that audio, which is unbelievable?
I got Michael to talk because I'd gotten to know him during the work on Framed, and you asked me about Framed, and um, I did a lot of research for Frame. Bobby came with his opinions and with a draft of something that I think was more opinionated than fact based, and I kind of put some meat on the bones, and I kind of tried to look at a variety of people who hadn't been looked at before. And I'm really proud of the research that I did on the book. That said, and I don't want to betray any conversations that I had. My conclusions are different than Bobby's. Bobby's conclusion in the book is that he found the real killers, I should say. And I was skeptical of it, and the more reporting I did for Dead Certain, the more skeptical I became of the two killers from New York theory.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were not in Belhaven that night, and I've talked to some people there that what Gaetano O'Brien is related was not true.
Well,
Anyway,
I mean, yes,
well, we have to
yes.
go on to the next segment, and we'll keep going because this is a great piece of work. I urge everybody to listen to it. We'll talk next segment, confessions or not. Executive producer and host of the NBC podcast Dead Certain, the Martha Moxley Murder, Andrew Goldman joins us. I want to jump in now to, the big allegation that the case was built around was that Michael had confessed left and right, particularly at this torture chamber he was in up in Maine. But there are some interesting facts about that. I heard Michael and yours described as Elon having that sign around his neck that said, "Ask me about my neighbor," or "I killed my neighbor," or "Did I kill my neighbor?" And it was good to hear that out of his mouth because I've read that and you don't know with all the stuff that came out of Elon whether that was really true. But here's my question on this stuff. He was not a suspect. He was not a public suspect. He had an airtight alibi all during that time that he was Elon. So where was that coming from? That there were suspicions, suspecting that he was the guilty one, and that he's even talking about it, when at that time none of us would have even considered him.
Michael's story on this, and you're free to dispute it. I mean, I've seen alternate versions of it, but Michael has said, well, first of all, what I have to know about Alon is that
Yes.
Joe Ritchie was not particularly interested in gleaning the truth from his, you could call them students, but I prefer to call them inmates. There were a lot of things that you heard about in trial. Uh, it was a system, much like Synanon, of putting pressure on people, and the idea was that you were going to break these teenagers down, these drug addicted and troubled teenagers down to build them back up. And they would use pressure points, and some of the pressure points would be totally fictional. Like there was a girl who had chapped lips, and they would berate her and say, "Admit you got these chapped lips from performing fellatio on a lot of men. Admit it, admit it, admit it." And it was, she was a virgin. This was not a girl that would do that. Uh, it was very standard practice at Elan for them to sit down with their families and find out what pressure points might be effective with their students. So Joe Ritchie and the people from Elan sat down with Rushton Skakel and his lawyer, Tom Sheridan, and talked about the background of Michael. And they talked about this murder. Michael says very specifically that for the first part of the time that he was at Elan, and there were these sessions where they literally beat him trying to get some sort of confession, where they would say, "Admit that your brother Tommy had something to do with this. Admit that your brother Tommy killed Martha Moxley. Admit it, admit it." Michael, if you know Michael, it's not out of character, ran away from Elan 3 times, which is, I think, a cardinal sin there, and you get beaten mercilessly for it. And Joe Ritchie redoubled his efforts to abuse Michael. And Michael said after the last time he ran away, Joe Ritchie specifically said, "Fuck that. We're not, I'm sorry. Uh, to heck with that. We're no longer going to get you to talk about Tommy. You did it. We're going to get you to admit that you killed Martha Moxley." And I think if you look at all of the testimony, with the exception of 2 witnesses, they say the closest that Michael ever got at Elan to saying that he did it after being beaten both paddled and with fists by some of the older boys at Elan. The closest he ever got was to say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And this was the kind of torture, I talked to one person who said, in 5 minutes, I would have admitted to anything they said, and Michael never admitted it. And at trial, there were many, many Elan witnesses that said that was the furthest they got at Elan is, I don't know, I don't know.
And yeah, and I'll say this. Let's say he did have real consciousness of guilt, which I think he has had in areas. It would be totally unfair to convict him with that kind of pressure. Just like Amanda Knox, who was tortured in Italy by just breaking her down. But these acting out things. The second big one to me is that again he has airtight alibi. He's in the backcountry watching Monty Python, and Michael and only Michael puts himself in the tree masturbating after he gets back, if he ever went, which I don't quite believe. But let's say he went. And that's again, you put yourself at the scene. And I read something that I didn't even know Mickey Sherman had said, which is that admitting being at the crime scene, masturbating in a tree the night of the murder was too much to overcome. Now, we both know he's justifying his losing. And in fact, when I said to Mickey when I interviewed him, well, if you believe that, then Tommy had to do it. And he didn't answer, but he said, yeah, basically. But there's another example. Why would you put yourself at a crime scene when nobody suspects you?
This is, I think, the central question of, one of the central questions of the podcast, and one of the reasons that a few of people who I really expect, journalists, listened to it and said they just can't get over the tree story. Yeah. I have theories about the tree story. I spoke to a lot of kids from Greenwich. And if you go back and you look at a lot of the kids, that their testimony at the time, these are 15-year-old kids who've had a friend of theirs murdered at 15. And I grew up in Portland, Maine, and we had a guy who was known as the Slasher, who injured a lot of kids, including a very good friend of mine. And I seem to remember very specifically it being so traumatic that wanting to kind of connect myself to this event in certain ways. And I think that a lot of the people that I interviewed wanted to connect themselves to the event. There was Jeffrey Byrne, who said the night of the crime, he was chased through the woods by somebody. And this is all this is all after learning that Martha Moxley was killed. Michael Skakel, if you listen to his taped confession, it is about Michael being in this tree, masturbating. He says he didn't masturbate to completion. Masturbating in this tree and then hearing rustling in the bushes. Michael is talking about, and I think the purpose of him telling the story, whether true or not, was saying, I saw the killers. I heard the killers. I was this close to being killed. And, Peter Zaluka, Martha's boyfriend, when he talked about how if he'd only been over in Belhaven, he could have been killed too. I think Michael was trying to connect himself to this crime. I don't believe that Michael was masturbating in the tree under which Martha was found, because it would make no sense if he was trying to peep. I don't believe Michael was trying to explain DNA evidence that might have been found at the scene. Whether you believe Bobby Kennedy or not, Bobby said as soon as he got sober, Michael started telling him this tree story. If you don't believe Bobby Kennedy, maybe you're going to believe one of the prosecution witnesses, Michael Meredith, who was put on the stand, who said that Michael told him this tree story in 1987. And I talked to Dr. Henry Lee and I said, would somebody, the theory that the state has was that Michael was trying to explain away DNA evidence that might have been found at the crime scene. He told this story to Michael Meredith in 1987. And I asked Dr. Henry Lee, what was the status of DNA in criminal cases in 1987? The first ever recorded case was at the very end of 1987. Michael did not know about DNA. Michael was not trying to account for biological evidence at the scene. Why did he tell that story? I frankly wondered. The story came out after he was at Elan. These are the first times I know that the story came out. It came out after Elan. Frankly, I wonder whether it was that night or a different night he was in the tree. I don't know whether I fully believe the story at all. He stands by it. I don't think that he would have told the story had he thought that it was going to implicate him in the crime. But this is, I think, the one sticking point that a lot of people who still believe Michael killed her had. I recently did a podcast with four FBI profilers who went through all the. I supplied a lot of the evidence, the autopsy, the crime scene photos, and they went through it and they basically said they deprioritized Michael as a suspect and just attributed it as a weird story. None of them put Michael at the top of the suspect list. And so if that's enough to convict somebody, a weird story about jerking off in a tree, I don't know about our justice system because that's all they
Yeah,
had.
I think it's of course I always thought that, I've talked to Tommy about it too because he changed his story, meaning he lied. And of course, Michael changed his story, and it relates to the Sutton report, which then would lead you to assume they were trying to account for DNA. Now, Tommy gave
But
me
Michael told that story long before
I
Sutton.
know. That's new news to me. Plus, what Tommy told me without violating his, our conversations are similar to something that you said in it, which is Russ Skakel's religious fanaticism,
Mm.
which
Well,
would.
I think that that's right. But I mean, I think when we're thinking about Tommy and we think about how tight this timeline was, I don't know if you agree with me, but the Greenwich police got a lot wrong. I think they got the time of death wrong based on the dogs barking, based on the fact that Martha had a 9:30 curfew, based on the fact that she'd blown her curfew earlier in the week and her mother had been irate. Based on the fact that at 9:30, when she was left alone in the backyard of the Skakel house.
All right,
Okay,
let's just
sure,
put the suspense right there.
sure. Okay,
Let that hang.
okay.
The man who got Michael Skakel to talk, Andrew Goldman. Let's jump right back into where you were on the night of the murder.
I think what you really have to think about in this case is the tightness of the timeline. The last time anybody reported seeing Martha Moxley alive was at 9:30 when a bunch of kids were in the Skakel backyard and two of them left. Helen Hicks and Jeffrey Byrne left because Martha and Tommy were becoming somewhat pretty flirtatious. And they left, and Martha said to Helen, "I'm right behind you." Um, so Tommy initially said, "I said goodbye to Martha at 9:30 and watched her padding through the leaves." Tommy subsequently, years later, he said that there had been no sexual contact. Years later, decades later, said he had been with her maybe 20 minutes longer than he had initially reported. And it's hard for him to really work too much with that timeline because they were seen together and she was seen alive at 9:30. And everybody has, and most people, and I tend to agree with it based on a variety of evidence, that she had to be killed at 9:50, around 9:50 or 10. So Tommy initially said, I said goodbye to her at 9:30. There was no sexual contact, and I watched her go. He subsequently changed his story and said, actually, I was alone with her for 20 more minutes or so, which would put him with her at 9:50. And said that there was consensual sexual activity, which involved mutual masturbation. It is a very, very tight timeline, and Tommy, in changing his story, put himself with her at the time that everybody believes that she was murdered. So I think that Tommy was either very unlucky and had this sexual assignation and watched Martha pad away, and somebody between the 200 yards between the backyard and her front door intercepted her and killed her. Or there's another story.
Well, I have my own version of what I think was happening there, which is and why the timeline is like this. Michael, jealous, in a rage, drunk.
Okay, but I need to
No, wait,
stop
wait,
you.
wait, wait. Let
Okay,
me just
all right,
finish that. Let me just finish that.
all right.
So the logic is he doesn't go to the back country, which again he may have gone, but I agree the timeline is 9:50. So he didn't go. He sees them in the bushes, picks up a 6 iron as soon as Tommy disappears, and
Okay.
therefore
All right,
the
Jim, let me ask
9:50
you
would
this. You know
fit.
a lot about this case, but I want to ask you, what is your evidence? And if you say Andrea Shakespeare, I'm gonna blow my stack because
No, no.
Andrea Shakespeare.
First off, I'm not going to challenge reasonable doubt. Okay,
No, I
because
don't think it's doubt.
it's one of the. It is
I
one of
think it
those
was
two guys. I
yeah.
think Michael is more logical for a lot of reasons, just because of Tommy was having sex with her, and why would you kill somebody afterwards except for one reason? But and one of the things Bobby conflates is the degree of disturbance of Michael at that age and Tommy to a different degree. And whether it's Sissy Hicks or whoever, Michael was out of control, full of rage. I have people that I know who said he seemed psychopathic to them at the time.
Mhm.
And I know that you disputed in the case that he was killing animals with golf clubs, which is a sign of serial killers. I had a woman tell me, this is ironic. I did a show on the Percy murder. I don't know if you know about that, but in Chicago. And she was listening to call that she had a tip on it, but she said, Jim, I happened to live in Bellhaven at the time, and Michael and Tommy were both problematical. Michael was definitely sociopathic, whatever you want to call. He used to
Mhm.
throw stuff at the bus when we would get off. We were scared of him. And so, in any event, it's a matter of motive. Now, could Tommy have had a motive? I believe in only one way is if he tried to have sexual intercourse and she said no and he went out of control. Other than that, I think it's one of two guys and one guy had more of a motive. Now I'll shut up.
Okay, so I just want to go over the motive of Michael Skakel first. Well, first of all, Mark Furman's book was the first one that blamed Michael Skakel for the crime.
Hmm.
Mark Furman's book, which was distributed in the Fairfield County State's Attorney's Office to all of the people who were working on the Skakel case, was used as I think a roadmap for the prosecution. The thing that Mark Furman never disputed was something that was never disputed by the police, which was that Michael went to Sursum Corda. He was 8 miles away
Right.
at 10 p.m. when the murder occurred.
Yeah. I don't believe that,
It
but
is
go
in the
ahead. Go ahead.
it is in the police reports, and it says it has been established that Michael was at Sursum Corda. So I feel like the idea that the prosecution tried to say that they tried to have it both ways. They said Michael could have killed her when he came back at 11,
Yeah.
which would have meant that he would have had to witness something at 11 p.m. Martha would have been 90 minutes late for her curfew. Martha had no alcohol in her system. Her judgment was not impaired. She had
Right.
told Helen Nix, I'm right behind you. This jealousy that you're referring to, have you looked at Martha's diaries?
I haven't. In there, she says at certain point, not like you had, that Michael seems crazy or something like that. And Andrew, by definition, masturbating in a tree out of a window is an obsessive act, and it was for Martha. And it was after he came back at 11 o'clock. Now, I agree. I'm a facts guy. So I can't prove this and make claims. I don't believe he ever went to the backcountry just because of that. He's in the car. He's watching his brother fondle her. It makes no sense to me.
But where do you get that he's watching his brother fondle her?
Because
Where,
he was in the front seat with her. And he was upset about it from what
This has not been in any of the
I,
police reports. This is a confection about the touching of Martha in the car. I think that there was definitely, after they left, the reason that Helen Nix and Jeffrey Byrne left the backyard was that they sensed something brewing with Martha. Did Michael? Perhaps he did. I mean, but I think that this obsessive act, there's a couple of problems with it. The first problem was, is Martha going to wait around to get murdered by Michael Skakel after 11 a.m.?
I don't believe it happened then. So,
Uh,
I believe it was
so
9:50.
then you have to believe that he stayed.
Yes. And
So
I can't prove that. That's why it's reasonable doubt. That's what it is. I think it was, and if you've seen the pictures, I have too, of Martha after being killed, it was a rage killing. It was not the tutor who didn't know her. It was not cavemen who really weren't there. And it's a rage killing. So it's only one of two people.
yeah.
And
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is one of the great tragedies, and I feel like you let Mickey off a little easy when you talked about a gross sense of injustice, and he was allowed to defend himself. I don't know if I changed your mind in the podcast. I honestly, if I didn't know any better, I would have thought that Mickey threw the case. He
Well,
did.
I'll say this: Mickey's defense was terrible. He was lazy. He ran off with some of the money. But this is a problem I have. Ineffective counsel is a very, very narrow, sleeping through it, no defense. Something is going. It is not. He had a defense, whether it was good or bad. And I've sat with Mickey. That was not fit the definition of ineffective counsel. Skakel's hired this guy. He was a clown. Everybody knows it. You call him a jokester. He would say I was in the top two-thirds of my class in Connecticut, and people wouldn't get it. The law school, that means he's in the bottom third, you know.
Yeah.
But ineffective counsel, to me, that was an abortion of justice. And maybe it was good luck because maybe he's innocent, but I will never buy that was ineffective. It was incompetent.
It was
Maybe.
totally incompetent. Look, I'm not a lawyer, and I feel like Jeffrey Toobin is on your side. And Jeffrey said that he found a judge who believed that he was innocent and found a way to get him off. But one of the things that Mickey failed to do. Have you seen these photos? Have you seen this picture of Michael at 15? This was within a month of the murder.
I got to tell you, that's another theory that I do not buy, that he was so small. I think I could, if I have a 10-year-old grandson, I think if he was in a crazy rage and maybe on drugs and stuff, I, a six iron is a brutal instrument. And if you hit repeatedly, I believe definitely that he could have done that at that size. And you know how he could have done it as well? I believe he was blacked out, which is
Well,
why he doesn't know either.
I think that
But
there's a lot of what I think that the failure, and one of the reasons that Michael is free now, and one of the reasons that they said that he was denied effective counsel, was the fact that jurors never heard about what happened between Martha and Tommy Skakel that night. Jurors heard nothing about Tommy Skakel. All they heard about was Ken Littleton. The theory, and I don't know if there's anything to it. Do you know how Mickey got his job?
I don't know. I don't know why they hired him. Honestly, to me, they
At
thought
the
they were
recommendation of Manny,
A Hollywood lawyer.
at the recommendation of Manny Margolis, Tommy's lawyer, and many of the early meetings were actually held at Manny Margolis's office. And Linda Kenny Bodden, who was initially on the defense team, said she couldn't understand how they could be holding meetings at the offices of the primary defender of decades of Tommy Skakel.
Interesting, yeah, and it's hard to believe Manny would be that cynical, but I do agree. We got to go right to the last segment, so hold on. We're back, our final segment. We've gone through a lot tonight, and I believe, by the way, psychologically, the Sutton, report builds a case that both of them could have done it, and somehow Rush inadvertently helped implicate them. But if you know Tommy and you know Michael, I know Tommy, you get a sense that Tommy knew he was loved and Michael did not, and they have fundamentally different psychological frameworks. I want to say one other thing about the backcountry story. I read this in his book, that was sort of stolen from them, and it made no sense to me. This is the biggest, most impactful night of Michael's life, and in the book, he describes coming back in the car with unbelievable, minute details. I went right to Google to say, is that a sign that he's lying or of guilt? Because it made no sense on the biggest night of his life that he somehow remembers these incredible little things. You probably read it too. And the masturbation thing, it looks choreographed. The ways I sensed something over here, I stepped at a light, maybe somebody saw. It almost looks choreographed. Other than, let me give you a shot now to go.
Well, that was Furman's theory too. I think, look, memory is a tricky thing. My
Yeah,
experience with Michael, I've dealt with liars before, as you have, I think, as well. And what's interesting about people who lie versus people who tell the truth is that the people who are telling the truth consistently tell the same story.
yeah.
Liars, it tends to change. And if you look at the Sutton report, and I'm not trying to implicate Tommy here, but his stories changed even when he was talking about the night of the murder. You know, how he and Martha actually hooked up after, how that all went down. That's the thing. And my producer at NBC News was saying, we listened to hours and hours of Michael's tapes. They are consistently the same story. And I don't know if you put any stock in this, but Michael has been sober for a very, very long time, long before he was tried for this murder. And the reason that he reunited with the Kennedy family was because he was the one who was welcoming many of his Kennedy cousins into recovery. And
Let me say, he's done a lot of good works that he should get credit since he got sober.
one of the things is that they say in AA. I'm not in AA, but you're as sick as your secrets. And basically, one of the tenets is if you are hiding something, you will drink that you have to basically unload and say everything. And if you know anything about Michael, you know how he frequently says far too much. And it's probably the reason he got into this situation that he's in, is because he told this story over and over. But I've spent so much time with Michael, and there have been so many times where I feel like this is too much information. I didn't need to know that. I don't think, and if you knew, do you know Michael personally?
No, I do not. Not at all.
If you spend any time, any extended period of time with Michael, you know that this person is incapable of withholding things. I just don't think he's a liar. I believe him. Maybe you might think I'm naive, but I've spent dozens of hours with him. I just don't believe he is lying about not killing Martha Moxley. I don't believe he is lying about about going to Sursum Corda. And if he was at Sursum Corda, I think it's case closed. If he was at Sursum Corda at 10 p.m. watching Monty Python's Flying Circus, he was not Martha Moxley's murderer.
I agree with that.
The Greenwich police again said it has been established that Michael was there for years.
And I do believe that if he was there, he did not. It was not done at 11 o'clock. I just will never be convinced by the logic. And the killing is a rage killing. Someone had to have a rage killing with a Skakel golf club, brutal. And to me, that leaves only two people. The rest of this is just uh, hocus pocus, you know. So once you narrow it to that, you have to ask yourself, well, who's the more likely guy? But, I'm the same way. You're saying, Michael got sober, he tells the truth. We know that isn't good enough for the case, just like it isn't good enough for me to assume because he was a jealous teen high, that he didn't go to the backcountry. I just find it illogical. And I also think I don't believe Michael knows really if he did it or not, because that kind of rage at that kind of age on those kinds of drugs,
What drugs?
I mean, he was on, he was drinking heavily. I don't know if he was on drugs. I learned
He
more
wasn't
about
on.
drugs.
There were no. They were
But
smoking pot. They were
he had had
smoking
a lot
pot
of,
that night and drinking.
he'd had a lot of alcohol
Yeah.
from the club beforehand, and you're right. The drugs I've only learned more recently of other stuff they've accused him of being on. But he was a raging alcoholic at 12 years old, which
He
is
was.
yeah, which is mind-boggling. I believe I think it's if he killed her, he didn't really know he killed her because he was blacked out. That still means he killed her. Again, I can't prove that. I would never claim that in a court of law or anything. I just don't see anybody else that could have done that murder. That's
Well, I think that jurors, and I think that this speaks to, Mickey said, "Oh, I couldn't have used any of the stuff from Sutton." He could have asked Helen Ix, which I don't believe he did on the stand, about Martha's curfew and about Martha saying, "I'm right behind you." Helen is, I talked to Helen the other day. Helen is convinced Michael went. I mean, this was sleight of hand by the prosecution to suggest that Michael didn't go. I don't believe that they actually believed that Michael stayed. I think that they knew she died at 10 p.m. and they had to come up with a reason. They had to come up with some theory that Michael was there. I
and
don't buy it.
I think, and I know you can't. I know I can't run with it because she changed her story. But Julie originally saw somebody run out of the bushes, which to me is perfect timing for he saw his brother do this. And I people will say Tommy's even well if he saw this, why didn't he come after me instead of Martha? And the answer is first of all, Tommy was a lot bigger than him. But if he'd had a golf club, that would have, and if he was blacked out, but in his mind, it was Martha that was betraying him, not Tommy.
Well, if you look in the diaries, there were a lot of boys that had heavy crushes on Michael. There's no
Yeah.
disputing that Michael had a crush on Martha, but so if that is the motive of jealousy of somebody messing around with Martha, half of the boys in Greenwich could have done it.
Well,
Michael,
you have to have the
there's
rage.
no sign.
You need the rage that Michael was carrying around with him. And I don't know if you feel this, but my feeling, this whole thing emanated out of Anne Skakel's death.
Yeah.
18 months later, the family collapsed. Rush collapsed. Nobody told Michael what was going on. He didn't feel he was loved. And you go on and on and on and on. And it's a culmination of a very, very tragic confluence of events.
Michael was a mess. Look, there's no doubt, and Michael admits as much. Michael did not fall out of a limousine when he was three years old and have anger issues that were
That's
so.
that's a good point. I agree too on that.
Tommy fell out of a limousine at 3 and basically had the symptoms. I think you would, when you see sometimes NFL players killing their partners, they attribute it after to CTE, and I think Tommy had something similar to CTE. His sister Julie told me he was never the same after he fell out of that car. They had to have people come and restrain him in the neighborhood because he would get so angry.
Yeah.
I've heard
I
stories
understand, and if you and I are in the same, that it's one or the other. And the thing is, Michael, the way you described him, I know Tommy, the sweetness of his disposition, the ability to have survived 25 years as a suspect for something he didn't do, if he didn't do it, it's hard to conceive of again. But both Michael and Tommy, we didn't know back then. And I think they were both really troubled. I just think one was in a different way than the other. But anyway,
but
I
one
want to
was at the crime, but one was at the crime scene and one was not.
I'll give you the last word on that. I want to thank Andrew again for doing a tremendous job. We're going to stick around after the radio version of this over and talk this through because there's a lot of stuff there, and I want to make sure Andrew feels he was fairly treated. Dead Cert, Martha Moxley Murder, and Jim Campbell Radio. Check out our YouTube channel. We're on Apple Podcasts, radio stations. Please check out my book, Madoff Talks, uncovering the untold story behind the most notorious Ponzi scheme in history from McGraw-Hill. Netflix, The Madoff, the Monster Wall Street from Joe Berlinger. Thanks again to Andrew.
Thank you so much.